Hello. Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to give you a flavor really of what we do here at Oxford with big maternity data. So at the Oxford Centre for Fetal Monitoring Technologies, what we do is we have routinely collected maternity data since 1993, and that includes early neonatal live data as well. And we are focused in monitoring babies during labor, and that means that at the moment we have over 100,000 labors monitored at term during labor, which results in about 20 billion data points of fetal heart rate. I'll show you what our data looks like. The concept is to use this data and individual risk factors for that mother, for that pregnancy, for that labor, and for that baby to come up with dynamic risk assessment for the fetus during labor. And we use every tool really in the toolbox to achieve that, AI and deep learning, prognostic models, simple decision trees as well. And I'll give you a flavor. So fetal monitoring, for those of you who may not be familiar, cardiotochogram or CTG, I will be calling it. In some parts of the world is electronic fetal monitoring or EFM. It's really non-invasive or semi-non-invasive way to detect the heart rate of the baby during labor. And we usually monitor contractions and sometimes maternal pulse at the same time. It's displayed on this paper strip. It can be 20 hours long or 2 hours long, depending on the labor. And this is what you get usually. So this is half an hour example. You've got the heart rate on top, maternal pulse contractions. And what clinicians are trained to do by looking at that paper strip or when it's displayed on a digital screen is to look for certain features of the heart rate and the contractions, right? So here I give example of the main things that they are trained to look for: the baseline, which is the trace in the middle, when it's not oscillating up and down. Decelerations are very important in labor, in particular their response to contractions, right? So contractions are challenging the oxygen supply. So how the baby responds to each contraction is telling us how it's coping with the lack of oxygen. And variability is quite important as well, and so on. So these are the main characteristics the clinicians are trained to look for. And it's a very difficult field. These monitors have existed for 50 years, and it's a little bit controversial, the benefit of using them, and yes, a lot of other things that are controversial. In terms of characteristic of the CTG, what should we look for? What should make us worry? And as clinicians, should we get the baby out early by a cesarean section or a forceps or ventouse if need be? Is the worst case scenario. And the international consensus of how to interpret these CTGs and what are the characteristics that I just showed you and what are the thresholds for them and the normal ranges for them. The international consensus has only been updated in 2015 once, and this was a difficult exercise from what I understand, because people disagree a lot, and there is very limited science behind it, very limited data, and no surprise people disagree. And every country more or less has different guidelines, even though the physiology, of course, is the same or very similar. And the NICE guidelines in the UK, they are under constant review almost. And the Americans have their own, and it's a huge mess actually. So one thing that has been very clear over time is that the variation in identifying these features and interpreting them is really large. Even the same expert will disagree with themselves at a later date when reviewing the same CTG. So people have been wanting to have computers analyze these complex graphs for a long time, and already in the 90s, people started developing these systems. So these are 3 commercially available systems, which use computers to identify these features that I just showed you, the baseline, the decelerations, the variability. So they are mimicking or emulating a clinical expert, right? So the idea is that they can perform the same way at 4 a.m. or at 4 p.m. and with a junior midwife or an expert consultant. So they should be more objective. They are more objective and they should be more reliable. Unfortunately, they have failed to show any benefit in clinical practice. And there are a number of reasons for that. And we have as well written a paper on it. And there are discussions in the literature about it. But I think one of the reasons is as well that they are limited by default. They can only do as good as a very good clinician. And these CTGs should be interpreted really in the context of clinical labor. You cannot just interpret them on their own. And that's part of the clinical guidelines, but it's not part of these emulation systems. So they're limited in how much they can help. So here a bit more data, about a bit more information about our data for those of you who are interested, how it looks. Massive archive of digital data routinely collected since 1993. So we've got all of the CTG traces done in our hospital. It's a big tertiary hospital with about 7,000 births a year. So about 60% of them are monitored. In the UK, we don't monitor low-risk pregnancies. So we've got different characteristics of the mom, of the pregnancy, the labor, the neonatal outcomes as well, whether the baby had seizures or sequelae in the neonatal intensive care unit. Of course, we didn't have HIE definition in the 90s, and we do now as a ICD code as well. So here since 2012, Anna Alarcon has been fantastic in collecting really detailed data, including MRI scans and EEG reports, and a 2-year follow-up for all the babies in our hospital with HIE, moderate to severe HIE. And then with time, we're getting more and more data. Now since 2016, we've got a routine 36-week scan with PCR ratios and other detailed biomarkers. So it's getting more and more detailed with time. So here I'm going to give a brief example of what we've been learning from data like this. So very important for us is to know the outcomes that we care for, a huge challenge in fetal monitoring actually. Here are exclusive for groups, severe compromise, which is not HIE only. It is a blanket umbrella term for all kinds of compromises that are happening to newborn term babies. And we've got the moderate mild, which are born based on cord acidosis and the normal outcomes. So what that allows us is to do this kind of audit graph that I'm so proud of. It's very simple and it's taken forever to produce. And the details are in the publications. But so now taking these exclusive groups, what you can do is look at the percentage of operative delivery for presumed fetal compromise for each of these groups. So what happened in clinical practice? How often in this group or in this group did midwives and obstetricians feel that the baby needs operative delivery? Usually about 1/3 of these are cesarean sections, crush C-sections in labor, and about 2/3 are forceps or von Schultz deliveries. And you can see a clear titration, right? The more severe the problems, the more the doctors have been intervening, which is, you know, great, and it's what you expect. But the sensitivity here is fairly low, and the false positive rate, or approximate false positive rate here, is very high, right? So it's 16% of the very normal ones, and this is the big proportion of babies, would have been delivered with crush operative delivery, section or forceps. But what that gives us is a benchmark, right? So now our prototype system for monitoring babies, which is based on the data, OXIS 1.5, and this is the published one and validated one. So we have these yellow bars now. We can have our data and we can learn from it, and we can use the computer algorithms that, unlike the ones that just emulate clinicians, start optimizing this, start aiming to have a very high yellow graph here and as low as possible, or the same level yellow graph here in the false positive. And usually if you have a reliable system, these ones would fall in between in a good way like this. So the details are in the paper. So I'm not going to talk in the full detail. What I want to demonstrate is that this OXIS 1.5 system is actually based on something super simple, very easy to calculate in the CTG or in the heart rate only. So if these are different heart rate dots over time, what you're looking for is every time the trace is going down. So these are these red graphs. And we usually do half an hour, between 15 and half an hour and 30 minutes. Every time there is a red bar, you take the average in that period of 30 or 15 minutes, and that's your DC, the decelerative capacity. So this is a computer-based metric of the heart rate. It's not based on the visual assessment, but it's actually something very intuitive that clinically you can understand very well. So here's some examples of 1 hour traces. This is a very small DC. You can, the obstetricians in the audience can recognize this is a very depressed infant with very low variability and no reactivity. And here is a very normal one. And here you can see the DC is going higher up. And then this is abnormal or borderline abnormal. There are decelerations. The obstetricians again would recognize this is likely second stage labor. But this is still, the baby is still maintaining baseline and able to cope. And here towards the end, you can see it's lost its baseline and it's basically decelerating all the time. It's quite abnormal and the DC is very high. So what this metric, the reason why I wanted to show it to you today is that it's very, very basic. It's calculated very easily. It's intuitive clinically, but it's actually really robust to signal noise and signal loss, which are very common in the CTG. And they can work, as you could see from the bar graphs before, they could work as well as clinical practice or even better. can be optimized on the data. And here's an example if you have one baby, so how it would work in practice. You can calculate DC every 5 minutes. Here we calculate an update, and you can see it's staying quite low and normal. It's oscillating. These are the normal sleep state cycles of the fetus. And you can see how it's going over a threshold that we have defined based on the data, for which your software can start saying that's a high risk, right? And this threshold in Oxid 1.5, we move it based on the risk factors. So if there is meconium or preeclampsia, that would be lower. And how low, it would depend on your data. So we've optimized on the data. And if the baby has no risk factors, the pregnancy has no risk factors, we can put that threshold higher up as well. So that's the concept of this. It's really proof of concept. It's not something that we are testing in clinical practice yet because we don't think it's good enough yet. We've put it on a tablet, a way as well for you to see how it would work in a clinical practice. This is a wireless device. It works anywhere in our maternity ward in Oxford. So what you can do is choose a different room, choose the different CTG, and then it would provide computer analysis. It would calculate different things, but it would calculate the DC as well, and it would provide a message. And this is ongoing. And now I'm very happy that we've secured the funds to really upscale it next year, if COVID permits. So here, this is a more later interface, the way it looks now. You see, we've added a lot more parametrics here, including an AI index, and I'll show you that later, artificial intelligence or deep learning index. So we're getting more and more complex, right? Here, more clinical risk factors that we care about. So the user can enter these ones in the tablet, and the tablet can take wirelessly in real time the CTG signals from the monitors, from the standard monitoring, and it can provide assessment. So that's how it would work in clinical practice. So a very general slide. As I said, I'm very ambitious about making the best out of the heart rate. It's only one vital sign, and it is going to be limited. It's not going to resolve all our problems in fetal monitoring. It's very important that people keep on looking for other solutions, ideally blood pressure or blood flow of the fetus to the brain. But for the moment, this is the only thing we can non-invasively measure over time during labor, and we need to make the best out of it. So here we are taking really a comprehensive approach and trying to use everything possible to improve from the data that monitoring these bar graphs, if you wish. So the yellow graph to go as high as possible in severe and as low as possible in the normal babies. So I'm just gonna mention more about deep learning in the remaining 10 minutes or so of this talk. But of course, there is a lot else going on, and I cannot stress enough the need for independent external validation, which we are working on. Sorry. So deep learning is the topic I think that it's buzzing around, and I've been asked to talk more about. So this is a paper we've published last year with this very complex title. I don't want the clinicians in the audience to worry too much about that title. I'll just give you a very general overview of what that means. So we used 35,000 CTGs to train that deep learning model. It's still ongoing work. It's not something that has been fully developed yet. It's a progress. It's a work in progress. But what we've published and what we've done as a proof of concept as well was take 35,000 deliveries from our archive, use 30,000 of them for training, and 5,000 carefully selected that they represented our outcomes have been kept aside for validation and testing. So this is a more scary graph where we wanted to give you a flavor of what multimodal convolutional neural network is like. So multimodal means that here, the contraction signal, so these are the contractions, we process fairly independently at the beginning in the neural network. And the heart rate, we process fairly independently in the neural network. And the quality, we help a little bit with the quality assessment because these CTG signals, as I mentioned, are very, very noisy and full of signal loss. So we feed to the neural network 3 different channels of data, and we combine together. So these are complex calculations that are happening here. The neural network is looking at the raw heart rate data and is looking on its own for the best features or characteristics. So we are not saying you should look at baseline. We are not saying you should look at decelerations. We are not saying you should look at DC or anything like that. We are saying you learn from the data, from a lot of data, the best features. And then together, they are combined here in the neural network, black box, as some people refer to it. I would disagree with the full black box description, because if you're experienced and if you know what you're doing, you should be controlling your network. You should be checking at all of these stages, at each of these stages what the network is doing. And you should be looking for a network learning from the data fundamental principles rather than just learning every little tweak, which would mean that that network would not validate on other data. So what it outputs at the end of the day is a number between 0 and 1, which gives you an assessment of the fetus risk score, basically. And there is a lot that can be spoken about that risk score here, but I'll move on in the interest of time. So here are our results. If you look at the figure again, these normal babies, this is similar to what we saw before with the blue bar. Here's just in green. So this is the rate of interventions with cesarean section or forceps or ventouse in clinical practice that happened on this data set, this 5,000 testing data that were not shown to the neural network during training. And you can see it's about 16%, the false positive rate, which is what we saw earlier. This subset is representative anyways. And we already knew OXIS 1.5, as we saw on the previous result, works a little bit better here, reducing the false positive rate. And here our neural network model, this new deep learning thing, we have capped the false positive rate to be on 15%. And then we look at what happens to the sensitivity. And here the sensitivity, in this case, we have combined severe and moderate compromise together into one group, and I'll mention that. So that's how we trained the model. And we can see the approximate sensitivity we can expect. So the clinical practice is about 30%, which is the same as what we saw before on the bigger data set with the blue bars at the beginning. The OXIS is a little bit better, as we know, and then the deep learning model, the new one, is improving on that a little bit. Not massively, but improving. So for the same false positive rate, improving the sensitivity. The more interesting part here for the obstetricians and neonatologists in the audience is that actually if you split that compromised group to the ones who have acidemia and the ones who don't have acidemia, of course, these are the more heterogeneous, the more difficult babies to detect with this definition of severe compromise, where you may or may not have acidemia. And this is where we didn't have so many babies for training, reason number one, but also reason number two, they are very heterogeneous, they are less visible in the CTG. You can see the deep learning model is pretty much failing here. The yellow bar is not doing very well. On the other hand, the ones that have acidemia, severe compromise or not, this is where the deep learning model is really, this is now a tangible sensitivity improvement. This is the kind of improvements we want to see as we progress further with developing methods. So the take-home message from me, and this is in the paper as well here, is that we really want to be using the best tools in the toolbox. So if we are trying to detect these ones, this is where deep learning can help us a lot. When we are trying to detect these ones, really the clinical risk factors and what we know clinically can help us a lot, and we should be combining them in the next generations of OXIS versions. And also when we collect more data with time, we should be able to get improvements here as well. But my point is that different methods have different value and different benefits, and with a lot of data, we can assess which ones are better for what and use them for their best possibilities. So just a final result on this, here I wanted to demonstrate the importance of the size of the training set. How, if you remember, we trained with 30,000 CTGs, and we examined here what would happen if we trained with a half of them or with just 10% of them. And what we're looking here is at the different training data sets, and what we're looking at is the sensitivity. So this is this yellow bar we just looked. And the reason why we have many and we have a range of values here is because we train multiple models, right? And that's what everyone should be doing. There are variances in the initialization of the weights of the model, and there are other elements. You can think of it as bootstrapping, what people do in statistics as well. This is how you assess whether your model is stable and whether you are likely to be able to generalize on new data sets. So what you can see here is that, you know, the variance is very big. The sensitivity is around 30%, but you know, it could be very low or higher. And if we train with 15,000, the performance is improving and the stability around that performance is improving. And with the 30,000 that we tested, that we trained eventually, we have a better sensitivity and tighter confidence interval. And next time when we train with 16,000, we expect to be somewhere here. You can see there is a bit of a natural limit on how good they can be with this architecture and for this kind of severe compromise definition. Of course, as I showed you, how you defined your outcomes is actually quite important. So the details are in the paper. So a final couple of slides just to promote what I've been doing as well. I'm so proud to be a co-organizer and behind this yearly events now every 2 years, gathering together really people from clinical fields, people from mathematics and computer science and AI, people from industry. We always have people from Philips and GE Healthcare and Ledrao and Huntley Healthcare, so really the fetal monitoring companies. And it's a really open forum. Everyone is invited. And I'm sad to say that this is kind of all of us that you see here on the photos. That's more or less most people in the world who are dedicating their careers or a big part of their careers in developing or researching new ways and better ways to monitor babies during labor. So I think it's really a field that needs more work going into it. It's a very important field, and I would invite everyone who would like to be involved, even if you only want to come and listen. It's a very friendly forum. So the next one is due in October 2021, but for the time being, we will just wait and see how the COVID pandemic plays out, and we might decide to postpone it a little bit or do it virtually. We will see. I would very much like to do it in person, so we'll wait for a little bit. The other thing I wanted to say is that, yes, so from this workshop, me and another 15 co-authors, I think, produced this review paper, which I would invite you to read, which is a very good review of every topic really relating to fetal monitoring and data, and using big data or not big data, using computers for fetal monitoring. And finally, I would invite submissions to our special topic in fetal monitoring in the age of AI and computer-aided decision support, really a multidisciplinary perspective. So the first publications are already online, and we are open at least until the end of the year for new submissions. We are looking for really diverse perspectives. So if you have something relevant, we'll be happy to see it. Thank you very much.